In the heart of the sun-scorched desert, where the wind carved whispers through jagged rocks and the horizon shimmered like molten gold, lone cabin stood against the endless emptiness. Its wooden walls were weathered by years of storms and blazing suns, yet inside, a faint warmth lingered. That warmth belonged to a woman named Leora, a widow who had learned to survive where few dared to tread. She moved with quiet strength, her dark hair braided tightly against the relentless desert heat, her eyes carrying both sorrow and fire. She had lost much, yet she had not lost the courage to face each day, carrying with her the memory of a love that the desert had claimed. Leora's life had become a rhythm of routine, tending to her small garden, mending what little she owned, and listening to the wind as if it spoke secrets meant only for her. The isolation had been her companion, the harsh desert, her teacher. But fate had a way of bending paths in the most unexpected ways. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in strokes of orange and crimson, a shadow appeared on the ridge. A man, lean and powerful, moved with the grace of someone who belonged to the land itself. His presence was impossible to ignore, even from a distance. He carried the weight of the wilderness in his eyes and the hunger of both body and soul. His name was Tavon, a young Apache warrior whose life had been appended by battles, betrayals, and a world that had forgotten mercy. Tavon approached the cabin cautiously, aware that strangers often welcomed danger as easily as they did kindness. Leora noticed him immediately, her instincts sharpening. She had heard stories of Apache warriors from traders and passing travelers, stories full of both admiration and fear. Yet there was something different about him, something that made her heart tighten with curiosity rather than alarm. His clothes were torn, his face smeared with dust and sweat, but his posture carried dignity. He did not demand. He simply watched, and in his watchfulness Leora sensed both desperation and nobility. "Are you hungry?" she asked, her voice firm but gentle, as she gestured toward the small kitchen where a pot of stew simmered over a fire.
Ow.
Tavon's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his rugged face. He had not expected kindness in this forsaken stretch of land. He nodded, stepping inside with the careful movements of someone who has learned to trust very little. The cabin, though humble, smelled of herbs and the faint sweetness of bread baked days ago. The firelight danced across Tavin's face, illuminating lines of hardship and courage alike. As he ate, Leora watched him, noticing the way he savored each bite as though it were a treasure. She sensed that beneath his stoic exterior was a man who had endured far more than most could imagine. Tavon finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying a resonance that seemed to belong to the open skies rather than a small wooden cabin. He told fragments of his story, the raids, the loss of family, the relentless pursuit by men who saw him as nothing more than a threat. Leora listened quietly, offering no judgment, only the silent comfort of her presence. Days passed, and the rhythm of the desert cabin began to shift. Tavon did not leave. He helped with chores, repaired fences, and hunted when the land permitted. Slowly, the walls around both their hearts began to soften, brick by brick. Leora found herself drawn to his quiet strength, the way he moved as if every step was in harmony with the desert itself. Tavon, in turn, found in her a sanctuary he had never imagined, a place where he could lower his guard, where compassion and trust were not punishable offenses. The nights were the hardest. The desert could be cruel after sunset, cold and unyielding, yet under the blanket of stars, they found moments of unexpected intimacy. Tavon would speak of his dreams, of a life unmarked by war, while Leora shared stories of the past she had buried deep within her heart. There was laughter, rare and precious, and there were silences so profound they seemed to speak more than words ever could. The desert around them became not just a home, but a witness to the fragile blossoming of trust and something even deeper connection. But the desert holds secrets, and shadows often stretch longer than one expects. Leora knew that letting a stranger into her home came with risk, yet her heart rebelled against fear. Tavon's presence stirred feelings she thought she had buried forever, feelings that made her pulse quicken and her mind race with possibilities she dared not name aloud. Tavon too felt a pull he could neither explain nor resist. In the harsh, unforgiving landscape where survival was a daily challenge, love began to take root like a stubborn desert flower, defying the odds. One evening, as the wind swept across the cabin and the first chill of night crept in, Tavon stood at the edge of the porch, gazing at the horizon. His hand brushed against Leora's, tentative at first, then with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally found a place to belong. He turned to her, his gaze unwavering, and whispered words that carried the weight of his heart and the depth of his longing. It was not just gratitude or respect, there was a claim, soft but unshakable, that bound them together. Yet just as the moment seemed perfect, a distant sound shattered the fragile calm. The faint echo of hooves pounding against the desert floor reached their ears, a reminder that the world beyond their sanctuary was still dangerous. Tavon stiffened, eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. Leora felt the sudden rush of fear and anticipation. Whoever approached could change everything. The peace they had fought so hard to carve out could vanish in an instant. And so, under the vast, starlit sky with the desert holding its breath around them, Tavon and Leora stood side by side, hearts racing, unsure of what the coming hours would bring. Would the warrior's past catch up to him? Could the widow's courage protect them both? The wind carried both promise and peril, and in that suspended moment, the story of survival, love, and destiny had only just begun. The desert waited, silent and unyielding, as if testing whether these two souls, one broken by loss, the other hardened by war, were meant to endure, to fight, and to love in a land that respected neither weakness nor hesitation. And somewhere between the shadows and the firelight, a bond was forming, strong enough to challenge fate itself, yet fragile enough that one wrong move could shatter it forever. The night deepened, the wind howled, and the first shadowed figures appeared on the ridge. Leora gripped Tavon's arm, her heart pounding with fear and something else, something she dared not name. Tavon's eyes were cold with determination, yet soft with unspoken promise. And as the darkness pressed closer, neither spoke, for they both knew that the moment of truth had arrived, and the desert would not forgive weakness. The story hung in the balance, a fragile flame flickering against the vast, unending wilderness, leaving the world wondering who would survive, who would be lost, and whether love born in the harshest of lands could truly endure. The first signs of movement on the ridge were subtle, almost imperceptible against the darkened sky. Tavon's hand tightened on Leora's, his instincts honed by years of survival alerting him to danger before the eyes could fully register it. The hooves grew louder, accompanied by muffled shouts carried on the dry desert wind. Leora pressed herself closer to him, heart hammering, feeling the warmth of his presence like a shield against the unknown threat. In the fading firelight, their shadows stretched long across the cabin walls, two figures bound by circumstance and an unspoken connection that neither fully understood. Tavon's mind raced. He had faced enemies before, men driven by greed or revenge, but the desert had changed him, made him wary of every rustle in the sand, every flicker of movement at the edge of vision. He crouched slightly, signaling Leora to stay low. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice a quiet command that carried both authority and care. Leora nodded, her pulse still thundering, her fingers brushing against the hilt of the small knife she kept at her side. She had learned the ways of survival from hardship, but nothing had prepared her for the sudden presence of danger that now pressed close to their sanctuary. The riders were distant shapes against the horizon, silhouetted against the dying glow of sunset. Tavon squinted, trying to gauge their numbers, their intent. They were not merely travelers. There was purpose in their movement, a determination that spoke of pursuit. Leora could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes sharpened, and she knew he was calculating every possible outcome. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. Tavon did not answer immediately. Instead, he shifted to the edge of the porch, scanning the ridge with the precision of someone who had spent his life reading the land, its dangers, and its secrets. "They're looking for someone," Tavon finally said, his voice low and steady. "Someone like me." His gaze met hers, dark and unwavering. Leora felt a shiver run through her. The thought of him hunted, of danger creeping closer, sent a wave of fear that mingled strangely with the deep, unfamiliar thrill of being near him. It was a feeling she had not known since her husband had passed, a stirring in her chest that made her aware of her own heart beating in response to his presence. As night fell, shadows thickening around the cabin, Tavon moved with silent urgency to reinforce the small wooden walls. Every plank, every shutter, became a potential barrier against the unknown. Leora worked alongside him, hands steady, despite the fear curling in her stomach. Together, They moved with a rhythm born of necessity, the danger outside, heightening the intimacy between them. Their eyes met more than once, unspoken words passing in the space between glances. There was trust building here, fragile yet undeniable, a bond forged not in comfort, but in the tension of survival. Once the preparations were made, Tavon and Leora sat close to the fire, listening to the wind and the faint echo of hooves far off. Tavon began to share fragments of his past, each story layered with pain and courage. He spoke of raids that had torn his village apart, of family lost to violence, and of a life on the run, where every decision could mean death. Leora listened, her hand brushing against his, her heart swelling with both sorrow and admiration. She had lived through her own hardships, the loss of a husband, the lonely struggle to maintain life in a harsh desert, and in Tavon, she recognized the same fierce will to survive. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden sharp noise, a branch snapping close to the cabin. Tavon's hand went instinctively to the small knife at his belt, and Leora's body tensed. The desert was full of whispers and shadows, and every sound carried potential danger. Tavon moved toward the window, peering into the darkness, his posture alert and protective. The night seemed endless, each moment stretching as they waited, uncertain of what or who was approaching. Leora's thoughts wandered even as she kept her focus on the immediate danger. She wondered about the life Tavon had lived, about the hardships he had endured that shaped him into the man who now stood before her, strong yet vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache with an unspoken desire. Tavon had seen too much pain, yet here he was, offering her protection and slowly allowing her into the guarded corners of his heart. And in turn, she offered him something he had not known he needed, a chance to belong, to rest, and perhaps even to love. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint smell of smoke and horses. Tavon's eyes narrowed, reading every movement, every shadow. "They're closer," he murmured, tension coiling in his muscles. Leora pressed herself against his side, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth that had become her anchor in this harsh, lonely land. She realized that the danger outside had only heightened the intensity of what was growing between them, the quiet realization that they were no longer just survivor and stranger, they were becoming something far more intertwined. Tavon's hand found hers again, gripping it with quiet determination. "No matter what happens," he said, voice low but resolute, "we face it together." Leora nodded, feeling the weight of his promise. In the unforgiving desert, where life could be claimed in an instant by both man and nature, trust and loyalty were more precious than gold. And in Tavon, she found both. Hours passed with tense silence, punctuated only by the distant sound of hooves that never seemed to get closer, yet never fully disappeared. Leora and Tavon remained side by side, alert and connected, bound by the shared certainty that the night could bring both salvation and danger. They spoke little, but every glance, every touch, carried the weight of emotions neither had fully expressed. Fear, longing, and the fragile beginnings of love intertwined, making the night feel both heavy and electric. As the fire dwindled to embers, Leora's thoughts drifted back to her past, to the husband she had lost, and to the life she had built alone in the desert. She had thought herself immune to attachment, yet Tavon's presence stirred something within her that defied logic. And Tavon, staring into the fire, thought of the family he had lost, of the battles he had survived, and of the strange, uncharted path that had led him here, to a widow who had offered shelter, and to a heart that seemed ready to trust him against all odds. The first hint of dawn began to touch the horizon, painting the desert in pale gold. The distant shapes of riders had vanished with the night, leaving only uncertainty in their wake. Tavon's eyes remained sharp, scanning the desert for signs of movement, while Leora finally allowed herself a deep breath, leaning against him in silent relief. Yet both knew that danger was never far from the desert, that the peace of a single night could not erase the shadows that waited beyond the ridge. And so, the morning light found them together, hearts still racing, yet bound by the quiet understanding that something new and unbreakable was beginning to grow. The desert around them remained harsh, unforgiving, and mysterious, holding both threat and promise. Their story had only begun, and the challenges that lay ahead promised tests of courage, trust, and the delicate power of love in a world that respected neither weakness nor hesitation. The sun rose higher over the desert, casting sharp shadows across the rugged landscape. Leora moved quietly around the cabin, her hands steady but her mind restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that the night had been only a warning, that the danger which had skirted their cabin in the dark would return with more determination. Tavon stood at the edge of the small porch, scanning the horizon, his jaw set in that familiar expression of vigilance. The wind tugged at his cloak, but he did not flinch. His presence was a constant reassurance, though the thought of what might come still sent a ripple of fear through Leora's chest. As they prepared a simple breakfast from the supplies Leora had stored, the subtle tension between them remained unspoken. Every glance, every small movement carried weight. Tavon spoke sparingly, but when he did, his voice held the authority of a man accustomed to survival and the softness of someone slowly letting himself trust. "They will not give up easily," he said, eyes narrowing. "Men like that hunters, not travelers, see weakness, and they chase it." Leora's heart tightened at the thought. She had already felt the pull of danger on her life, but now, with Tavon by her side, fear was entwined with a strange exhilaration. The morning passed in quiet vigilance. Tavon made repairs to the roof, mended a broken fence, and checked the edges of the property for signs of intruders. Leora assisted, though her mind wandered to questions that had yet to be asked. Who were these men? Why were they pursuing Tavon? What would happen if they returned with intent to destroy? She found herself stealing glances at him, noticing the way his muscles flexed under his sun-darkened skin, the steady rhythm of his movements, the quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from him. Each glance reminded her that survival in the desert was not just a test of strength, but of heart. By midday, Tavon decided to take a short patrol around the perimeter, leaving Leora at the cabin. While she watched him disappear over a ridge, the distance between them making her pulse quicken. Alone, the desert seemed even more vast, empty, and threatening. Leora kept herself busy, tending to her small garden and checking the larder. But her thoughts kept returning to Tavon. He was a man of secrets, a survivor shaped by violence. Yet here he was, slowly letting her into the folds of his life. She could not deny the stirrings in her heart, the warmth that came with every small gesture he made. When Tavon returned, he was quieter than usual. His eyes held a shadow she had not seen before. He set down a small bundle of herbs and meat he had gathered and finally spoke. "They are not far. Saw tracks along the northern ridge at least 6, maybe more. They ride with purpose." Leora's stomach nodded. "Will they find us?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Tavon's hand brushed hers, a grounding gesture that was meant to calm, though it did little to ease her fear. "We must be ready," he said, "and we must trust the land and each other." As the afternoon sun burned over the desert, Tavon shared more of his past. Stories of his family, the tribe, and the battles he had survived filled the cabin with a quiet reverence. Leora listened, captivated by the depth of his experiences. She realized that he was more than a warrior. He was a man who carried the weight of generations, who had faced loss and survived, and who now allowed himself to feel something that went beyond duty or survival. In return, Leora shared stories of her life after the loss of her husband, tales of loneliness, resilience, and the unyielding desert that had shaped her into the woman she had become. Even as they shared these intimate moments, the tension outside never fully left. Tavon had noticed signs of movement, birds startled into flight, dust rising in the distance, the faint creak of wood that hinted at someone moving closer. He began making preparations, fortifying the cabin with subtle reinforcements, securing the perimeter, and setting small traps along likely paths of approach. Leora observed his methods, learning from him, feeling both admiration and a deepening connection. There was a trust forming between them, a recognition that the other could be relied upon when the world outside remained uncertain. By evening, Tavon suggested they move beyond the cabin for a short distance to better understand the terrain and anticipate threats. Leora agreed, following him through narrow passes and rocky ridges. The desert around them was both beautiful and deadly sun-bleached rocks, cacti sharp as knives, and the ever-present horizon that could hide enemies as easily as it revealed the sky. Tavon led with quiet confidence, guiding her through paths only someone who understood the land could navigate safely. The closeness of their walk, the brush of arms and hands against one another, carried a tension that was both thrilling and dangerous. During this exploration, they came across an old abandoned trading post half buried in sand. Its walls were riddled with holes, the roof caved in, but it offered a glimpse into the lives of those who had tried to thrive in the desert before them. Tavon ran his fingers along the weathered wood, tracing symbols etched long ago. "They were here," he said softly.
Ow.
"Men, women, families. They trusted the land, and it gave them nothing but challenge." Leora felt a chill as she looked around. There was beauty in the remnants, yet it was a stark reminder that the desert did not forgive weakness. Their own small cabin, fragile as it might be, suddenly seemed more precious than ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched across the land, deepening the feeling of anticipation. Tavon and Leora returned to the cabin, each step carrying the weight of both danger and unspoken desire. Inside, the fire crackled and flickered, throwing light across their faces. They worked together in silence, preparing food and tending to the small fire. Words were few, yet every glance and gesture carried meaning, a mixture of trust, attraction, and the quiet understanding that their bond was growing stronger with each passing moment. Night fell, colder and sharper than before. Tavon moved to the edge of the cabin, listening to the desert, while Leora kept watch near the fire. The faint sound of hooves returned, more distant than the night before, but enough to remind them that they were not safe. Tavon's eyes were hard with focus, yet there was something else in them, an unspoken promise that he would protect her, no matter the cost. Leora's hand found his, and she squeezed it lightly, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her own. Within the cabin, as the wind howled and the desert held its secrets close, Leora and Tavon found moments of quiet connection. They spoke of dreams, of the life they might share if the world allowed it. But the fear and uncertainty outside reminded them that every day, every hour, was a battle for survival. The approaching threat was more than a test of courage. It was a test of trust, loyalty, and the fragile beginnings of love that had taken root in the harshest of lands. As they sat close to the dwindling fire, listening to the desert's whispers, neither spoke of what the night might bring. They only held on to each other, aware that danger was near, yet unwilling to let it overshadow the bond that was forming between them. The wind outside carried both promise and peril, and as the night deepened, the story of the desert widow and the Apache warrior continued to unfold, full of tension, mystery, and a love that refused to be denied. The desert waited, silent and unyielding, as Tavon and Leora prepared for the unknown. Shadows moved on the horizon, and the distant sound of hooves reminded them that their trials were far from over. In that fragile, fleeting moment, every heartbeat mattered, every glance held meaning, and the story of survival and love in a harsh, unforgiving land continued, leaving the future uncertain but undeniably compelling. Night had fallen over the desert like a heavy cloak, and the wind carried a chill that seemed to reach into the bones. Tavon stood at the edge of the cabin, scanning the horizon, his senses alert to every whisper of movement. Leora sat near the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap, yet she could not stop glancing toward him. There was a tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if the desert itself held its breath, waiting for what was to come. The faint sound of hooves returned, this time closer, sharper, and more deliberate. The men had tracked them, and their intent was clear. Tavon's eyes narrowed as he studied the ridge. 6 riders, maybe more, approached under the moonlight, shadows against the silvered sands. Their faces were obscured, but their presence carried menace and determination. He signaled Leora to stay low and moved with silent precision to the edge of the porch. "We will not be caught off guard," he whispered, his voice steady despite the tension gripping him. Leora felt the warmth of his hand brush hers, a grounding touch that reminded her of the trust they had built, of the bond slowly growing stronger between them. Inside the cabin, they moved in practiced silence. Tavon checked the perimeter one last time while Leora readied small supplies, ensuring they had water and whatever tools could aid in defense. Her heart raced, not just with fear, but with something deeper, an awareness that every moment with Tavon felt charged with meaning. Their shared glances were more than reassurance. They were a silent acknowledgement that danger, while pressing, could not break the connection forming between them. The first horseman reached the outer edges of the ridge, the faint jingle of spurs and the low murmur of voices carried on the wind. Tavon crouched behind a boulder near the cabin, keeping watch while Leora stayed close to the fire. her hands tightening around a small, sharp knife she had learned to wield in desperation. The desert was silent in stretches, the tension punctuated by sudden noises that made her jump and Tavon react instantly. Every shadow was a possible threat, every gust of wind a warning. As the hours dragged on, Tavon began to sense the riders' strategy. They were not moving recklessly. Each step, each maneuver, carried purpose. They were hunters, skilled and patient, testing the limits of those they pursued. Tavon whispered to Leora, "They are trying to draw us out, to make us act first. We must stay calm, stay ready, and wait for the right moment." Leora nodded, though her chest tightened with anxiety. Each passing minute stretched into an eternity, every sound amplified in the vast emptiness around them. The desert around the cabin seemed almost alive. The wind carried scents of sand and smoke, faint but distinct, while the rustle of desert shrubs hinted at movement just beyond vision. Tavon's instincts sharpened with every step, every heartbeat. He moved silently to check the northern edge of the ridge, returning with a wary glance. "They are dividing their numbers, trying to circle us. We cannot leave the cabin, not yet." Leora felt a shiver run down her spine. The isolation she had once found comforting now seemed like a trap, but Tavon's presence reassured her. Hours later, when the moon was high and the desert glimmered in silver light, Vaughn and Leora heard the first caller, sharp, guttural shout from the ridge, meant to intimidate and confuse. Tavon's eyes darkened, muscles coiling as if ready to spring. He moved toward Leora, his hand brushing hers in a silent promise. "No matter what happens," he said, voice low but unyielding, "we face it together." Leora's chest tightened. The bond between them had grown in the fire of survival, and now, with danger pressing close, it felt unbreakable. Suddenly, a horse broke from the shadows, charging down a narrow pass toward the cabin. Tavon moved like lightning, intercepting the path, and Leora followed instinctively, her knife ready. The rider shouted, words lost in the roar of the desert wind, and Tavon deflected the first strike, forcing the horse to veer off course. The clash of wills and survival filled the night, shadows moving like restless spirits around the cabin. Leora's heart pounded in rhythm with Tavon's movements, awe and fear intertwining. Even in the chaos, moments of tenderness pierced the tension. Tavon's hand brushed Leora's arm as he maneuvered around the approaching riders, a small gesture that spoke volumes in the silence between attacks. They had fought side by side in countless ways already, against the desert, against hunger, against loneliness, and now they faced men who would test every ounce of their courage. The growing connection between them became a source of strength, a quiet defiance in the face of encroaching danger. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. The desert made time feel like a living thing, stretching and compressing with the rhythm of wind and sand. Tavon and Leora retreated into the cabin when the moon briefly hid behind a cloud, using the cover to strategize. They shared whispered words, plotting how to keep the intruders at bay. Leora felt fear, yes, but also a fierce determination. She had faced death in the desert before, and now she faced it with Tavon by her side, someone who had become her anchor, her protector, and the stirrings of something more. From a distance, the riders regrouped, their voices carrying over the desert, plotting, questioning, waiting. Tavon listened, deciphering intentions from tone and timing. He knew their numbers, he knew their strategy, and yet the unknown remained their skill, their resolve, and whether they would strike in the dead of night or wait for the perfect opportunity. Leora's hand found Tavon's, squeezing lightly, a shared heartbeat against the uncertainty. Each moment stretched, fraught with anticipation, and the desert seemed to hold its breath along with them. In the quiet moments between threats, Tavon spoke of the life he had dreamed of before the violence, of the family he had hoped to build, and of a world beyond constant survival. Leora listened, feeling the depth of his longing, her own heart opening to the possibility that love could survive even here, in the harshest landscape. Yet even as the words passed between them, the reality outside remained relentless, reminding them that hope alone was not enough. The night reached its peak tension. Shadows shifted near the northern ridge, hooves striking against stone and sand. Tavon and Leora prepared silently, each aware that the next moments could determine everything. The fire cast trembling light across the cabin, and they moved together with unspoken coordination, instinctively knowing the other's thoughts, the other's intent. Fear, desire, trust, and courage intertwined in a fragile dance that the desert itself seemed to watch. And then, just as the first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon, a horn echoed from the ridge's signal that the hunters were advancing, that the moment of reckoning was imminent. Tavin's hand covered Leora's, their eyes meeting with a shared intensity that needed no words. Every sense was heightened, the scent of dust and sweat, the sound of approaching hooves, the coolness of the desert night fading into morning light. In those final moments before confrontation, the bond between Tavon and Leora held firm, unshaken by fear or uncertainty. The desert, with all its danger and beauty, framed their struggle, their trust, and their growing love. The approaching threat promised chaos, yet their connection offered strength, courage, and a fragile hope. The riders' shadows crested the ridge, silent, menacing, and ready. Tavon and Leora stood side by side, hearts racing, the entire desert as their witness. Every second counted. Every choice mattered. And the story of the Desert Widow and the Apache warrior reached the edge of its most intense hour where survival, love, and destiny would collide in ways neither could yet foresee. The first rays of dawn painted the desert in soft gold, turning every ridge and rock into a painting of light and shadow. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Tavin's eyes remained fixed on the approaching riders. But there was a shift now, confidence tempered by the knowledge of the land and the trust he and Leora shared. They were no longer just survivors. They were a force bound together, ready to face the final challenge. Leora stood close to him, her hand lightly brushing his arm, a touch that grounded them both. Her fear had not vanished, but it had been replaced with determination and a quiet certainty that together they could endure anything. As the riders crested the ridge, Tavon stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. The leader of the group, a tall man with a cruel, calculating gaze, hesitated at the sight of Tavon's stance. The others faltered, sensing the unwavering strength in the warrior before them. Tavin's voice, calm but resolute, carried across the desert. "You came from me," he said. "But this land is not yours to command. Leave now, or face the consequences of your choice." His words were met with silence for a heartbeat, and then, as if testing their resolve, the riders advanced. Tavin's strategy, honed over months of survival, came into play. He guided Leora behind small ridges and rocks, using the terrain to their advantage. They moved as one, silent and precise, communicating without words. Leora's heart raced, but she matched his movements, every step a testament to the trust they had built. The riders, skilled though they were unprepared for the unity and instinct Tavon and Leora displayed. The desert itself seemed to bend around them, every gust of wind and shifting shadow working in their favor. A tense standoff formed near a narrow pass where the canyon walls funneled the attackers. Tavon's eyes gleamed with calculated intensity. He had no desire to shed unnecessary blood, yet he would not allow anyone to threaten Leora or the life they were building together. The leader of the riders hesitated, realizing the tables had turned. Tavon's skill, his knowledge of the desert, and his unwavering resolve created a presence that none of them had anticipated. Leora, standing close behind him, felt the surge of adrenaline mingled with a deeper, more intimate sensation. Tavon's hand found hers, a grounding anchor amidst the chaos. Their bond, tested in fire and fear, had solidified into something unshakable. She realized that love, born in the harshest of landscapes, had a strength beyond circumstance. And Tavon, sensing the depth of her courage, felt his own heart swell with protectiveness and admiration. The standoff reached its peak when the riders attempted a final desperate move, charging through the pass with raised weapons. Tavon and Leora reacted in unison, using the narrow canyon walls to their advantage. Tavon's movements were swift and precise, while Leora displayed the courage and resourcefulness he had come to trust. The desert, their ever-present ally, seemed to guide their actions, turning threat into opportunity. In the end, the riders faltered, their confidence shattered by the unwavering unity before them. As silence returned, Tavon and Leora stood amidst the quiet desert, catching their breath. The threat had passed, the danger neutralized not through brute force alone, but through courage, intelligence, and the unspoken bond between them. Tavon looked at Leora, his eyes softened with relief and something more profound. "You were brave," he said, his voice carrying warmth and admiration. Leora smiled, her chest still pounding, feeling the truth of his words resonate through her. "We were brave," she corrected, their hands meeting and gripping each other tightly, a shared acknowledgement of the journey they had endured together. The desert morning seemed to embrace them, the sun climbing higher, casting light across the cabin and the surrounding land. Ivana and Leora returned to the small home they had fortified together, each step lighter now, buoyed by the knowledge that they had survived not just the desert, but the threats that had sought to tear them apart. The cabin, once a refuge, now symbolized the life they could build, a life anchored in trust, love, and mutual respect. Inside, Tavon and Leora worked side by side, repairing the cabin and tending to their provisions. There was laughter now, soft and genuine, blending with the gentle crackle of the fire. Their connection, tested by fear and danger, had grown into something steady and enduring. They spoke of the future in hushed tones, imagining a life beyond survival, love tending the land, sharing stories, and embracing a love that had blossomed under the harshest circumstances. The days that followed were filled with a quiet rhythm of rebuilding and bonding. Tavon taught Leora the finer skills of tracking and understanding the desert, while she shared knowledge of the home and its small comforts. Their evenings were spent under the vast sky, sharing stories and dreams, each moment deepening the intimacy that had begun in fear and uncertainty. The desert, once a place of isolation and danger, had become a sanctuary where love, courage, and hope could flourish. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the desert blushed with the colors of twilight, Tavon took Leora's hands in his gaze unwavering. "You saved more than just my life," he said softly. "You saved my heart. And now, I cannot imagine a life without you by my side." Leora felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of relief, joy, and the profound understanding that their journey together had only just begun. "And I cannot imagine my life without you," she replied, her voice steady, despite the emotions swelling within her. In that moment, the desert seemed to pause, acknowledging the bond forged through trials, danger, and shared courage. Tavon pulled Leora close, and for the first time in the harsh expanse of the desert, they allowed themselves to fully embrace the peace, trust, and love they had earned. Their lips met in a gentle, unhurried kiss, sealing the promise of a future built not just on survival, but on companionship, respect, and a deep, enduring love. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now echoed with warmth and laughter. The surrounding desert remained vast and unpredictable, but Tavon and Leora had learned to navigate it together. Every ridge, every shadow, every whispering wind was no longer a threat, but a reminder of the journey that had brought them here, of courage, resilience, and the power of love to flourish, even in the harshest landscapes. As the sun rose the next morning, spilling golden light across the cabin and the endless sands beyond, Tavon and Leora stood hand in hand on the porch. The desert stretched before them, vast and untamed, yet it no longer felt lonely or threatening. Together they had faced danger, weathered fear, and discovered a love that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. In the quiet strength of their bond, they found a home not just in the cabin, but in each other. And so, the desert widow and the Apache warrior stood side by side, hearts intertwined, ready to embrace a life full of love, hope, and the enduring promise of tomorrow. They had survived the night, conquered the threats, and discovered that even in the harshest places, love could bloom with a strength and beauty that nothing could destroy. Their story, born of courage and trust, ended not with fear, but with a beginning, the promise of a life lived together, fully and fiercely, under the vast, open sky of the desert. The wind carried their laughter across the sands, testament to the bond they had forged, the battles they had faced, and the love that had blossomed against all odds. Tavon and Leora, united not just by survival but by heart, looked toward the horizon, knowing that together they could face anything the world in the desert might offer. Their story had found its peace, its resolution, and its joy, leaving the audience with a lasting reflection. even in the harshest lands, love, trust, and courage could endure, flourish, and transform life in ways no one could anticipate.